Wealth that lasts for generations teaches a certain gait. It moves without hurry, it speaks rarely, it chooses where to sit and lets others come closer. It keeps its linen crisp, its minutes unpublic, and its fingerprints off the obvious instruments of power. It does not roar, it refines. It learns the topography of law the way a sailor learns currents, and it pilots its vessels accordingly. The children of such fortunes are trained to recognize what is durable and what is theatre. The durable is ownership and control, the theatre is appearance. A family may appear to give money away. In fact, it relocates authority into quieter rooms. The American Family Foundation is one of those rooms. It is a room built with tax code and trust law, double walls laid between private desire and public purpose, where the air is temperate and the clocks keep time for decades rather than quarters. The typical form is a private, tax-exempt entity that accepts donations from a small circle and disperses grants to the world beyond the garden wall. Gifts into it can yield income tax deductions and remove assets from the estate tax ground where inheritances burn. The price of admission is regulation. The reward is continuity and often a broader kind of leverage than direct ownership ever allowed. The early American princes understood this long before the statutes were perfected. Andrew Carnegie's endowments arranged libraries by the thousands and endowed technical schools because he believed capital should return to the community after it had done its work. John D. Rockefeller used a sequence of vehicles from the General Education Board to the Rockefeller Foundation to convert oil wealth into public health, science, and universities. Steel and oil could be regulated or broken. A foundation, once chartered, could endure with its charter mission intact, compounding influence through patient grants and reputational gravity. By the middle of the 20th century, the foundation had become a third pillar alongside the family company and the family trust. It was neither a business nor a household, and therefore it could move in places that were closed to both. Foundations could fund universities and laboratories, think tanks and orchestras. They could convene. They could hire scholars and underwrite reports that travelled more easily in polite society than the memos of corporate public affairs. They could endow a chair at a university and, with it, a vocabulary. They could anchor a museum and, with it, a canon. They were, in short, instruments that turned capital into context. Law noticed. In the 1960s, after a series of investigations into excesses and entanglements, most famously centered on the Ford Foundation's reach, Congress rewrote the rules. The Tax Reform Act of 1969 recast private foundations as powerful but tightly fenced gardens. A private foundation would henceforth pay a small excise tax on investment income, make qualifying distributions each year equal to roughly 5% of average assets, avoid any self-dealing with insiders, shed concentrated business holdings over time, refrain from partisan politics, and ensure its grants did not become taxable expenditures. The bargain was clear. The state would grant tax privileges and legal permanence. The family would accept transparency, separation from the business, and a disciplined cadence of giving. For families that thought in half-centuries, this bargain was almost elegant. The 5% payout rule gave foundations a metronome. The ban on self-dealing forced professionalization, independent directors, outside auditors, policies for conflicts, written grant agreements, and legal walls between the operating company and the charitable entity. The excess business holdings rule, limiting control of operating companies, was more than a prohibition. It was a prod toward diversification. The family would not keep the factory in the foundation. It would instead keep the world, a portfolio of public securities, bonds, and later private partnerships, watched over by committees and consultants whose job was not drama but duration. Notice how control migrated rather than diminished. Where a patriarch once sat on the board of his own enterprise, a foundation board now sits over an endowment and a grant-making plan that softly sets agendas in education, public health, and public taste. The Rockefeller Foundation helped underwrite the Green Revolution and built reputations in epidemiology and international development. The Ford Foundation bankrolled legal aid and civil rights organizations, shaping doctrine by husbanding talent over years. The Mellon endowments threaded money into art and universities. A Mellon grant could be a password. No law was broken. The tax code was followed. Yet the effect was unmistakable. A set of families transmuted company power into agenda power and did it with receipts stamped charitable purpose. Under the hood, the machine is technical and precise. A private foundation is governed by a board of directors or trustees, often including family members and one or more independent fiduciaries. Its assets sit with a custodian. Its investment policy statement speaks a language of prudence, modern portfolio theory, risk budgets, liquidity tiers. Endowment law, through the Prudent Investor Rule and statutes like the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, expects the board to balance current grant-making with the preservation of purchasing power for later heirs of the mission. That means inflation assumptions, spending rules that drift around that 5% floor, and a discipline about distinguishing corpus from spendable return. Boredom, in this space, is not a risk. It is a requirement. The grant side has its own grammar. Each grant requires a charitable purpose recognized by law, relief of the poor, advancement of education or science, public health, arts and culture. Due diligence is documented to avoid the sin of taxable expenditures. If a foundation wants to fund an individual, it must have pre-approved procedures. If it wants to travel near the political line, it must stay on the educational side and avoid attempts to influence specific legislation or elections. The vocabulary here is dry: expenditure responsibility, equivalency determinations for foreign grantees, pre-grants and post-grants, restricted use clauses. But the dryness is a feature. It allows money to cross borders of jurisdiction and reputation with minimal friction. Within these constraints, dynasties learned to cultivate leverage. Some chose program-related investments, below-market loans or equity that count toward payout, so that capital could revolve rather than disappear. Others adopted mission-related investments, aligning the main endowment with the foundation's themes while still pursuing market returns. A grant might seed a research center. A program-related loan might renovate a clinic. The endowment's managers might hold municipal bonds that finance the pipes beneath both. When it is done well, the foundation is a closed-loop ecosystem. Grants, investments, and relationships reinforcing one another until a priority becomes a landscape. Tax law placed tripwires along the path. Self-dealing is prohibited in almost absolute terms, disallowing sales, leases, loans, or services between the foundation and disqualified persons. Insiders such as substantial contributors, directors, officers, and their businesses. The penalty is not social embarrassment, but excise taxes that can bite the individual as well as the entity. There are rules against jeopardizing investments, too speculative for a prudent fiduciary, and penalties for failures to file or to distribute. There is a ban on certain lobbying and electioneering, but these offences a careful estate architect can see in the blueprints. The families who think like architects, the ones who hire counsel early and audit themselves before the revenue agents do, find that the fences channel rather than curtail. The remarkable thing is how foundations reorder family psychology. A fortune that, left to itself, might splinter into rivalries instead finds a common project. A foundation board becomes the family's parliament. Cousins who will never run a refinery can chair the audit committee, read the minutes, and visit the museums their grants sustain. The ritual of meetings, the cadence of docket books, the annual letter from the chair, all of it becomes a civic education for heirs. Power is domesticated. It learns to speak in the tense of policy rather than appetite. The family name poured into a building outlasts appetites anyway. There are, of course, case studies that feel like novels. The Pugh family's oil fortune migrated into a constellation of foundations that eventually joined to form a public charity with national reach, acquiring the velocity of a public institution while still echoing a family's sensibility about thrift and research. The Robert Wood Johnson wealth, seeded by a company of dressings and bandages, endowed one of the most consequential health philanthropies in the country. The Kellogg name, born of breakfast, sustained a foundation whose trust long held a commanding stake in the company. In each instance, the excess business holdings rule forced an orderly loosening of the grip, but the reputational grip tightened. The brand escaped the factory and settled over a field of ideas. Sometimes the foundation sits beside a separate investment trust or holding company that owns the family's stake in the enterprise. In these designs, the foundation is pure charity and the trust is pure ownership, with a firebreak of governance and legal personality between them. The trust may live in a jurisdiction known for patient fiduciary law, and the foundation may live in the state where the museums are. The two can look at each other across a terrace, coordinate where permitted, and otherwise keep to their lanes. It is choreography, and the tax council is the choreographer. To outsiders, the alchemy can appear to be public relations, but the financial engineering is deeper. A gift of closely held stock into a foundation at a well-timed valuation not only reduces income tax, it removes future appreciation from the estate tax calculation. If the shares must be sold under the excess business holdings rule, the proceeds become a diversified endowment that will fund grants forever. The family has, in a sense, converted a single business risk into a perpetual influence stream. The Internal Revenue Code allowed it, asked for certain courtesies, and continues to monitor the guest list. Meanwhile, the city notices that a new arts centre is possible, a scholarship is permanent, and a public-private alliance has a new hinge. Foundations cultivate adjacencies. A grant to a policy institute is entirely legal if it funds non-partisan research and education. A fellowship places scholars who will, in time, write regulations or advise judges. Museums funded by foundations decide which works are shown and which are stored, which creates a strata of taste that eventually becomes a market. A university chair defines which authors get taught as essentials. After a decade, an electorate recognizes those names as common sense. One need not conspire when one can curate. The dynastic families who did this well learned 3 quiet habits. First, they accepted that endowment management is a craft and hired or trained professionals who could endure boredom without losing alertness. Second, they designed succession so that the foundation's mission could survive adolescent quarrels and late-life revelations. Third, they treated compliance as a scout, not a jailer, asking the lawyers to show them the terrain rather than erect unnecessary walls. Those are not glamorous arts, but they generate a kind of fragrance that is mistaken for luck. All of this depends on a story a family tells itself about time. The impatient fortune tries to move public policy directly and is often caught at the gate. The patient fortune funds a school of thought and waits for its graduates to acquire the pen. The impatient fortune writes checks enthusiastically and discovers a decade later that enthusiasm was not a strategy. The patient fortune writes smaller checks along a single contour and finds, in the 3rd decade, that the contour has become a watershed. The impatient fortune thinks of a foundation as a vault that leaks. The patient fortune sees it as a seed bank. It is tempting to dress this in romance, and one should resist it. Foundations carry genuinely public obligations. They can ossify, they can drift, they can become shy around the very problems that need force and spine. For every family that built a cathedral of purpose, another put its name on a shell and visited only when the gala season demanded. The tax code remains a bargain, not a sacrament. The state has the right to revise, review, and revoke. The watchfulness is healthy. It reminds the grandsons and granddaughters that charity is not a private hobby, but a public trust. Still, when you walk the quiet floors of certain libraries and clinics, when you read the footnotes of certain court decisions, decisions, or the acknowledgements of a scientist's paper, you can see the long outline of a family's will. Not the will that distributes jewelry and rugs, but the will that chooses a century and leaves a mark upon it. The tools are unromantic: a charter, bylaws, an investment policy, grant guidelines, minutes, audits, the measured 5% spend each year, and the care not to trip the wires labelled self-dealing taxable expenditures. Jeopardy. The result is something that looks like a city learning a language. A foundation is a teacher of accents. If you wish to understand power in such families, do not begin with the yacht or the townhouse. Begin with the boardroom, where the agenda has only 3 verbs: preserve, allocate, disclose. Listen to how they talk about duration, about the friction of moving a policy 1 degree a year, about the virtue of building a cadre of nurses rather than a wing with a plaque. Notice how the conversations train heirs to speak in memoranda and not in boasts. Watch how the foundation chair steers discussion away from the temperament of donors and toward the statement of investment beliefs. This is how dynasties teach their young to think like stewards, not customers. There is an elegance in converting a taxable dollar into a public good, and there is a strategy in converting a public good into a field where your family name is always in season. The American Foundation makes both possible. It sets a family's money in a larger river and, with well-placed stones, encourages the current to bend slightly toward a garden the family has tended for years. People walk through the garden and call it a park. They are not wrong. The genius is to make the line between private intention and public value so fine that it appears like craftsmanship rather than control. What the old houses learned is that reputations are the longest compounding asset. The law, sharpened by 1969 and refined in the years since, gives a framework for turning that insight into architecture. Give assets to a private foundation under rules all can read. Manage them as a prudent investor. Distribute at least the required share each year to qualified, durable purposes. Avoid the forbidden entanglements. Use instruments like program-related investments when they advance purpose and replenish capital. Invest the endowment in a way that neither betrays the mission nor fantasizes about renouncing risk. Tell the truth on the forms. Invite good critics onto the board. Let time do what time does. By the time a century has turned, a family can be unrecognizable in its private habits and still legible in the institutions its foundation hosts. A scholar in a lab, a nurse in a children's hospital, a curator in a quiet gallery, a legal aid lawyer in a cramped office. Each is a living dividend from an endowment assembled by people who understood that real power prefers clean ledgers and patient calendars. If it seems like magic, look again. It is policy, arithmetic, and the manners of permanence. And in certain rooms, where no one raises a voice, the foundations of control keep their promise by spending, year after measured year, exactly as required, and by moving the country, inch by deliberate inch, toward the vision engraved in their charters.